The exhibition was dominated by the Führer's demand, create the German Volkswagen. Opel believes it already has it, the P4, the cheapest small car of its time. The company tries to get the government contract, but fails. Hitler wants a vehicle that can also be used for military purposes, that the people can use for their excursions into the expanses of Europe by paying 5 marks a month. The bucket car becomes the most popular VW model. Nevertheless, Opel is allowed to construct its Volkswagen, the Blitz. In 1935, after negotiations with the Wehrmacht, it builds the truck factory in Brandenburg. The Opel management, which at that time also included the Americans, is quick to recognize the lucrative business prospects offered by military contracts. Built for the new American production methods, the plant is the most modern in Europe. Every day, 120 trucks leave the conveyor belt.
Es war also dieser Opel Blitz das Rückgrat der Wehrmacht.
So it was this Opel Blitz, the backbone of the Wehrmacht, produced by Opel, and this is quite clear, with American money.
Amerikanische Gelder gebaut.
Without the Blitz, Hitler would not even have got as far as Vienna. When the Germans advance to Austria, numerous vehicles from other companies break down. Overnight, hundreds of Opel Blitzes are requisitioned in Bavaria near the border so that the Wehrmacht can march into the Austrian capital. Hitler is grateful. He visits the factory in Brandenburg and orders a further 2,000 Opel Blitzes. In the 30s and at the beginning of the war, one American is particularly active in taking care of GM property in Germany, James D. Mooney, vice president of the company. In 1938, for his services in furthering Opel's development as a leading ordnance factory, Hitler awards him the Order of the German Eagle, the party's highest distinction for foreigners. Wherever it is deployed, the Opel Blitz passes all tests with flying colors. In the conquests in the east, in the annexation of the Sudetenland, and in the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and also in the Blitz campaigns in the west. Within a few weeks, in 1940, Holland, Belgium and France are defeated. When the war begins, the production of private cars in Rüsselsheim virtually grinds to a halt. The machines lie idle, the number of workers diminishes as they are called up to serve in the Wehrmacht. The factory wants to stop this development, and the Luftwaffe also has a new use for Rüsselsheim. Opel now produces basic assembly parts and engines for the Ju-88, Hitler's most important bombers.
Grundsätzlich war schon wenige Tage nach
Basically, only a few days after the outbreak of war, close cooperation had been organized between the Luftwaffe and the factory in Rüsselsheim. This had been also supported by a visit from Vice President Mooney, who was not only corresponding with the Nazi leaders, but was also present at the time in Berlin. He came to Rüsselsheim and also then met Göring.
Mit der NS-Führung, sondern zu der Zeit auch in Berlin anwesend war, hier nach Rüsselsheim gekommen ist und schließlich mit Göring auch zusammengetroffen ist.
In his talk with Göring, Mooney expresses a certain understanding for the policies of the Nazis. He also believes that after the First World War, Germany had been treated too harshly by France and England. Göring encourages Mooney to mediate between the belligerents. Mooney approaches President Roosevelt, and the latter agrees to be prepared to act as a moderator. Roosevelt wishes Mooney good luck for his mission. Berlin, February 1940. With a flattering letter to the dear Reich Chancellor, Mooney gains access to Hitler in his new Reich Chancellery. In a diary which was never published due to objections by GM, he records his talk with Hitler. In his report to Roosevelt, he describes Hitler as warm and friendly. However, Roosevelt is unimpressed by the Führer's megalomaniac demand that Nazi Germany be recognized as a world power. Mooney has played out his role as a useful idiot. After this, Messerschmitt, the Under-Secretary of State in the State Department, calls Mooney a fascist. The strange episode concerning the Nazi friend Mooney had no influence on the course of history. Opel continued to build military vehicles, over 100,000 in the war years, urgently needed due to the high losses. In 1941, General von Schell, Hitler's director of mechanization, confirmed that without this company, war could never have been waged. Meanwhile, the Battle of Britain had been lost. Nor was Opel able to produce the Ju-88s at the speed with which they plummeted from the skies. This has a positive effect on the profits. In the party and in the ministries, this arouses envy and resentment. In 1941, GM refuses an offer to sell Opel and to withdraw from Germany. In a letter to the Reich Commissioner for Enemy Properties, GM reports that it has just begun to identify with Germany's fate. Behind this, however, is a financial consideration. GM had just claimed a tax deduction in the USA for its property in Germany and had thus earned $22 million. If the Reich had compensated GM, it would have had to pay tax for this.
During the first 2 years of the Second World War, the American management remained in place until around the middle of 1941, where they started getting very nervous and getting Americans out. So the executive boards of these American companies were still run by Americans. It was American CEOs who were going to the German Rüstungskommando and figuring out what quota of trucks are we supposed to provide, how many forced laborers do we need, how are you going to get us the labor and the materiel, where do we fit in your overall production scheme. They saw that their customer had certain needs, and they set out to meet those needs as efficiently as possible.
Meanwhile, GM is earning huge profits on American armaments, which are now being organized by Mooney. As a high-ranking reserve officer, he sees himself as a patriot. Mooney's boss, Sloan, explains the business philosophy behind this. An international enterprise which is operating throughout the world should carry out its activities in accordance with strictly economic criteria, regardless of the political views of the country in which it is operating. We are no charity organization. We make profits for our shareholders.
Wir sagten mal, das ist doch ein Witz, nicht? Dass hier werden die LKWs hergestellt, womit die Amerikaner bekämpft werden.
We said that must be a joke. Here the trucks are being produced, which are used to fight the Americans. Yes, that's how it was. And still there was no attack. And so we said, sure, after all, the Americans are not so stupid that they destroy their own factory. The Americans are not so stupid. The Brandenburg plant is almost completely destroyed by American bombers on August 6, 1944. Years later, however, GM receives $32 million as compensation from the American taxpayer. In 1921, Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, was published in a German translation. Between Henry Ford, the legendary automobile manufacturer, and Adolf Hitler, there existed from an early date a spiritual affinity, anti-Semitism. Ford's book confirmed Hitler in his hatred of Jews and served as a model for his inflammatory book, Mein Kampf.
In Hitler and in the European fascist dictatorships, the owners of the American economy saw a possible solution to their own problems with their own workers' movement and their own unions. Unions, in Henry Ford's view, were the work of the devil.
Hitler's brutal method of dealing with the unions was highly approved of by Ford, who kept armed militias in his factories. Even before Hitler seized power, Ford supported him financially. A portrait of the benefactor hung in the Munich headquarters of the Nazi Party.
As far as Henry Ford is concerned, he was understood as an inspiration for Hitler at that time. He was much more than this. Henry Ford was a kind of god of mass production, or the Pope, I should say. Thousands of people would write to him every day, "You are the greatest hero. You introduced this factory system that has made America so great." Fordismus became the kind of ideology of the German industrial class. They wanted to do it just like Henry Ford showed them how.
Detroit is still the home of Ford. The factories at Piquet, now industrial ruins, once housed the assembly lines from which rolled Ford's famous Tin Lizzie, the first mass-produced cheap automobile. Cologne, 1930. Henry Ford himself lays the foundation stone for his own factory in Germany. At first, business is not good. His cars are too expensive, and many Germans have an aversion to foreign companies. Any average German car owner who buys a foreign car nowadays cannot claim that the reason was its higher quality. For our German cars can now no longer be beaten by foreign ones. In the early 30s, the Ford plants are not working to full capacity. Cologne and Detroit, where Henry's son Edsel has taken charge, seek a solution. In a confidential paper to Edsel, Cologne points out that in Germany a war economy is developing, in which government contracts will become increasingly important. The Americans have no problem with this. They sell their 8-cylinder as a unit for a military jeep. The Ford plants begin to toe the Nazi line. Detroit also goes along with the next concession. The foreign automobile manufacturers are no longer allowed any rubber for tires, nor do they get any foreign currency for import. They have to obtain rubber by means of an exchange deal and have to hand over 25% of the imported rubber to the Nazis for armament purposes. Hitler, friend of the factory, is grateful. Finally, Ford cars from Cologne are permitted to use a stamp of quality German product. Business with the government thrives. In 1938, Ford and Opel are included in the plans of the Wehrmacht, which quickly needs 100,000 trucks, among them heavy traxial trucks and chain-driven vehicles. The Nazis are in a great hurry. In 1938, they want 1,000 trucks at once from Ford. The Cologne plant can't deliver so quickly. The Americans are eager to help out. They apparently have no misgivings. The engines, chassis and cabins of the trucks delivered by Detroit are put together secretly at night in Cologne and then picked up at daybreak by the Wehrmacht.
Just at the moment when the entire world is focused on Czechoslovakia and the Nazi drive to blackmail Czechoslovakia and move into the Sudetenland, just at that moment, the Nazi military comes to Ford and says, "We need 1,000 trucks now." And, I'm going to ask you, does it seem plausible to you that Ford does not know what these 1,000 trucks are for?
The commission was no secret to Ford. The Nazis had even paid for part of the delivery with precious dollars, but Ford only admitted this decades later. Hitler had already awarded Henry Ford the Order of the German Eagle for services rendered. At the end of 1938, Ford has it pinned to his lapel by the German vice-consul in Detroit. Ford now also shows his appreciation for their lucrative business deals. On Hitler's 50th birthday, on the 20th of April 1939, the company transfers 35,000 Reichsmarks to the donation fund AH. During the first years of the war, the production of trucks increases dramatically. There's no record of Henry Ford protesting against this. When Henry Ford hears that the plant in Dearborn is to produce 6,000 engines for the British Royal Air Force, he objects. He only accepts commissions for the defence of the USA, he writes to the London Daily Mail. Yet Ford has no objection to the fact that the French plants under the German occupation regime are working flat out for the Wehrmacht and producing 1,000 trucks a month. The boss of Ford France, Maurice Dollfuss, wants to keep the plant for the Ford family. He resists the influence of the Cologne plant and feels himself directly responsible to the Fords.